campground, the same campground that I went to as a kid. It was in Carlisle, about 30 minutes away. It wasn't owned by our denomination or anything, just, paid for the week. And I remember when I was a kid, there was a path that would go through the woods to this cliff that looked out. It wasn't a river, but I think it was called Common Creek down below. You could look out across the valley and the plains, Porterfield down below. But when I got there was no path anymore. I found out later, sadly, it was because a camper one time threatened to commit suicide. I jumped off, so they thought, let's just not let the path remain, so no campers know about it. But I knew that there was this lookout there, right? So I found my way through the woods, and I found my way to this lookout, and it still had rusted, but these metal bars, a part of it, and you could look out. I sat there that first morning to pray and gather my thoughts for the day. And I'm praying, this is where the story gets bizarre. All of a sudden, this beast of an animal comes jumping off the cliff and stands about as far away as you and I are. And it was big. It had like devil eyes, and it had these big horns that went back. I'd like to say I'm brave, but I just one look at it, I was like, and I ran as fast as I could. And I went to the directors at the camp and I said, guys, there's like this beast of an animal, at least 200 pounds, it climbed up the cliff and stared at you, it's evil. And they just laughed and laughed and laughed. And they said, there's no such thing like that. So the next morning, okay, I probably exaggerated it in my mind, psyched myself up. I went back, there at the lookout, trying to pray, a little uneasy, right? Sure enough, after about 10 minutes, this beast of an animal comes climbing up the cliff. About this far away, staring at me, and I once again, and I ran away, right? And I told the camp directors again, and they're like, you're scared of Bambi. I wasn't Bambi, and they started laughing at me. Well, about 3 months later, I get a call from the camp directors, and I was vindicated. They said, well, couldn't believe it, but one of our staff saw that animal a couple of weeks ago, and we did some investigating, and it turns out an African wildlife safari about 20 miles away lost an animal a few months back, and it's been living in our cliffs. I think it was an ibex, but I'm trying to remember now. So I looked it up about 5 years ago. I was like, that's how I remember it. But oh man, I feel a little embarrassed because I should have known it was not a native Pennsylvanian. So today I want to cover a little bit of Thursday night into Friday, and then I was praying about what I wanted to share as a final word with y'all. So I wanted to transition and give a mini sermon Sunday morning on Saturday of the week. Is that okay with everyone? Okay. So we talked about this briefly, but we mostly focused on the new love command yesterday, right? Yeah, that's what I remember it looking like. Isn't that scary? Yeah, yeah. Look it up later. I mean, they're big. Well, where did you call them horns?
Antlers.
Give me nightmares tonight. Anyways, back to Holy Week. So the new love command, right? And then they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. You all remember this. Jesus asks them to stay right there and pray. He goes and he prays, and it says he sweats something like blood, right? Saying, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done, right? And all that. And then love comes. We talked about this a little bit. And they come armed with clubs and swords to arrest Jesus. And right, Peter brings out the sword, chops off the ear of the high priest's servant's ear, and Jesus heals him. And he says to Peter, put your sword back in its place. I think I've slided this. For all who draw the sword will die by the sword. And the Church Holy is one of those quotes in there, that document that I gave you guys. He said, I think he said it best. He said, Christ in disarming Peter disarmed every soldier. Really interesting, huh? Right after this, though, and I briefly mentioned this, we read that everyone deserted Jesus and fled. In fact, in Mark 14, verse 52, it says that one of them, sounds kind of bizarre at first, it says he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. And that seems strange until we remember him, and they accuse him of blasphemy. And if this had happened a couple years before, they could have put Jesus to death on their own. But Rome, to humiliate the Jews, actually took away that right from them a couple years before. It said you actually have to get approval to put someone to death by the provincial ruler, Pontius Pilate. So Friday morning, they bring him before Pontius Pilate, and they change what they accused him of. Before Pilate, they don't accuse him of blasphemy, because what does Pilate care about religious rigor? So instead, they say he refuses to pay taxes, and he calls himself the Messiah, a king. In other words, they accuse him of sedition. And Pilate says to Jesus, you might remember this line, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Remember that? He asked Jesus. And in Greek, you didn't have bold font or underlining, right? So one of the ways you would emphasize things was by which word you put first in a sentence. And the word "you" comes first. And so it's probably more accurate to say that he didn't just say, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Rather, Pilate looked at Jesus, and he looked at this man and thought, "You are the king of the Jews? You stand before me bloody, beaten, and rejected by your own people, claim to be a king?" And Jesus gives this kind of cryptic non-answer. It's really hard to translate the Greek. Some translations say he just says, "You said so." Other translations say, "It's as you said." Sometimes I wonder if he's being a little more snarky, or he said, "That's what you said." Like our kids sometimes do. "You said it, not me." But then in John's Gospel, Pilate presses Jesus further. In the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Synoptic means with one eye, and they often are very similar in their accounts, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's all Pilate says to him. But in John, Pilate presses him further and says, "What is it you've done?" And Jesus' response was, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight." Now, and with these words, Jesus acknowledged that he was indeed a king. But as he insisted throughout Holy Week, said his kingdom was not advanced through force. And then we come to a very interesting moment. So the Gospels kind of present Pontius Pilate as at least semi-nice, right? But other ancient writings from the time depict him as being quite cruel and mean, actually. And it says in all four Gospels, thus indicating just how important this scene is, that Pilate presented the Jewish people with a choice of who to release. Said it was his custom at this time to offer them the prisoner, right? And this probably wasn't Pilate being compassionate. It was probably a calculated move to placate the Jewish people during a time where tensions were high, right? We already talked about what Passover is all about. And so the Gospels actually differ. Two of them say that the crowds initiated and said, "Pilate, hey, remember this custom of yours? We want Barabbas." Two of the other Gospels have Pilate initiating. But either way, all four Gospels say that the choice came down to, who do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus? Do you guys remember that? To understand what this scene is about, I believe you have to be able to answer two questions. I think I have a slide for it. What crime did Barabbas commit? And what is the meaning or the significance of his name? So Barabbas was not in jail for a petty misdemeanor. He wasn't in jail for refusing to pay taxes. He wasn't a convicted swindler or engaged in theft. Does anyone remember why Barabbas was in jail? Insurrection, yeah. And can anyone go just a little bit further with that? That's usually the last thing people remember. That's really good. Says in 3 of the 4 Gospels that he was in jail because he murdered someone in a past insurrection attempt. Oh, okay, there you go. Are you a Paris combined? It's Power Rangers. He was in jail for murdering someone in a past insurrection attempt, likely a Roman soldier or a Jew who was conniving with the Romans, right? In other words, Judas was a violent revolutionary, albeit a failed one, but at least he had proven his willingness to fight. for the liberation of his people. What about the significance of his name? I'm going to say it with a southern accent, Barabbas. Let me pronounce it a little differently for you. Barabbas. Anyone recognize at least one word in there? Son of what? Son of Abba. Yeah. Yes, you're exactly right. What does Abba mean?
Father.
Father. Barabbas, the name literally means son of the Father. And Matthew's gospel actually gives us his first name. Any guesses?
Jesus.
Jesus. Jesus, son of the Father. Suddenly, we start to understand the significance of this choice. Throughout Holy Week, two competing ways of making peace collide. And now, as these two rival messiahs stand before us, we each must choose between the two approaches to peacemaking that they represent. Jesus of Nazareth, he calls us to the way of peace by loving our enemies in the practice of radical forgiveness. Jesus of Barabbas, on the other hand, is willing to fight our wars and kill our enemies in the name of freedom. Which one will we choose? As the remaining events of Friday make clear, you can't choose both. Well, to connect it back to Palm Sunday, when Jesus entered and subverted the crowd's expectations that he was coming like Judas Maccabeus to bring a hammer down upon the Romans, right? It took until Friday morning for the crowds to realize that Jesus was not coming in the likeness of Judas Maccabeus to bring a hammer down upon the Romans. And so when we realize, and I say we, because I think we're meant to see ourselves in the crowd, when we realize that Jesus was not coming as the hammer of God, we chose one who would wield a hammer upon our enemies. And then we picked up a hammer and we crucified Jesus on the cross. And do you remember Jesus' dying words? Remember the very first words were that Jesus said when we nailed him to a cross? For they know not what they do. I think we're meant to see those words in contrast to Mattathias' dying words. Do you remember that gentleman? The Asian Jewish priest who stabbed the apostate to death, fled to the hills, and gathered his 5 sons around him, his middle son being Judas Maccabeus. And his dying words to them are these: avenge the wrong done to your people, pay back the Gentiles in full. And those dying words sparked a violent revolution. And I think Jesus' dying words sparked a revolution too, albeit a non-violent one. And they couldn't be more different than Mattathias' dying words. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And the crazy thing about forgiveness is it has an uncanny ability to create a future where none seems possible. On the cross, we unleash all of our fury and hatred onto Jesus. And in return, having endured our wrath and absorbed our sin into himself, Jesus responded with radical forgiveness. And as Christ-like peacemakers, we too must seek to break the cycles of violence through costly forgiveness. Well, like I said, I want to end my time with a little sermon. And I was praying about what to share with you, and my initial thought was to give a sermon on the resurrection. Well, that's just a great way to talk about the resurrection and the implications of that. But the more I sat with it, the more I felt like God was laying in my heart to share a message about Saturday of Holy Week. It was often called Silent Saturday. And my guess is for those of you who've grown up all your life in church, Most of us probably never heard a sermon on Saturday of Holy Week. Right? The main reason most churches don't talk about Saturday of Holy Week is because all the gospel writers have very little to say about Saturday of Holy Week. Matthew reports it in chapter 27 that on Saturday the chief priests and the Pharisees petitioned Pilate to place a guard at Jesus' tomb. The only other scriptural writing about Saturday is in Luke chapter 23, where we read that after making preparations on Friday evening for Jesus' burial, they had to stop at sunset. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, rested on the Sabbath. So that's it. That's the full coverage of Saturday of Holy Week. That the chief priests and Pharisees asked Pilate to put a guard at Jesus' tomb, and that the women rested. But despite the day's relative silence, the Gospels still provide us with a window into the hearts and the minds of the disciples between the time of Jesus' death and their learning of the resurrection on Easter Sunday. John chapter 20, verse 19, it states that the disciples spent Sunday morning and presumably Saturday gathered together, hiding in a locked room for fear of the Jewish leaders. And in Luke chapter 24, we read that as soon as the Sabbath ban, Sabbath being Saturday back then, as soon as the Sabbath ban on travel had passed, two followers of Jesus, they hightailed it out of Jerusalem, apparently in an effort to distance themselves from the authorities. We read that their faces were downcast as they spoke of their hope for Israel's liberation dying with Jesus. You know, when we read the Gospels, the time between Jesus' death and his resurrection, it passes by in a flash. In two of the Gospels, it's a period, a space, and now it's Sunday. Yet Saturday must have felt like an eternity for the disciples. Hiding all day in a locked room, they had nothing else to do but sit with their emotions. And after the trauma of the previous day, numerous strong emotions were certainly swirling inside of them. Guilt for having abandoned Jesus. Despair that the person they had placed their hope in was dead. Confusion as they struggled to understand why Jesus never put up a fight. And perhaps strongest of all, fear. Fear that the Jewish leaders and Roman authorities would hunt them down. Fear that they would soon succumb to the same fate as Jesus. If I had been one of the disciples sitting in that room on Saturday of Holy Week, I would have been saying to myself, how could I have been so naive? I've just wasted 3 years of my life following after yet another self-proclaimed Messiah. I mean, yes, I thought Jesus was different. I thought he was the real deal. But I should have known better. I've seen others claim to be God's Messiah, and I know how the story ended for them. Simon of Perea claimed to be the Messiah. Rome beheaded him. Athronges claimed to be the Messiah. Rome promptly executed him. Judas, the son of Hezekiah, claimed to be the Messiah. Rome killed him, and 2,000 of his followers were crucified. That's how the story always ends. Rome kills every would-be Messiah. Caesar remains on the throne. Death has the last word, and nothing changes. Saturday must have been a very dark day for the disciples. Can you put yourself in their shoes? Do you feel what they were probably feeling on Saturday? Well, so far, we've focused on what the disciples were doing during the time between Jesus' death and their learning of his resurrection. But I want to ask another question. What does the Bible say, as strange as it may sound, that Jesus was doing while his body lay in the tomb? According to Matthew chapter 27, and I have a slide off of this, still on top of the chair. When Jesus died on Friday, the curtain of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised. After Jesus' resurrection, they came out of their graves and went into the holy city where they appeared to many. First Peter, in chapter 3, it adds this, that after Jesus was put to death in the body, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits. That's interesting. Never heard a sermon on this before. These verses allude to what theologians call Jesus' descent into hell, or the harrowing of Hades. Protestant reformers like John Calvin, they spoke passionately about the importance of Christ's descent in their writings. Yet surprisingly, most Protestant and evangelical churches today say very little on the subject. In fact, often the only time you hear the descent mentioned in many churches today is when they recite the Apostles' Creed, which, incidentally, we sang some lyrics from in the first psalm. Here's part of it. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. The third day he rose again from the dead. Well, despite the inattention that this teaching receives in many Christian circles today, Jesus' descent was actually of immense importance to the first Christians. And I want you to be aware of the church's historical teaching on this subject. So let me give you just a few examples. So if you like history, you're probably perking up right now. If not, hang with me, okay? The earliest surviving collection of Christian hymns that we have found is called the Odes of Solomon. Odes of Solomon. It contains 42 hymns in total, and the climactic final song focuses on the liberation of those in hell. The hymn is written with Jesus himself as the speaker. And here's a few lines from the hymn. Soul song and was shattered, and death ejected me and many with me. Those who had died ran toward me, and I placed my name upon their head, because they are free, they are mine. References to the harrowing of hell, they're not just found in early Christian hymns. John Calvin actually wrote in his famous work, The Institutes, quote, there is not one of the early church fathers who does not mention in his writing Christ's descent into hell. Interesting. In the 2nd century, Bishop Melito of Sardis, he delivered a sermon on Holy Saturday. And here's a pretty cool fact. Just like the Odes of Solomon are the earliest hymnal we have in the church, this sermon from Bishop Melito is the earliest sermon we have outside of the Bible itself, like in Acts. The earliest sermon we have about Holy Week, and it focuses on Saturday. In the sermon, Bishop Melito imagines Jesus saying this to hell's captives. I order you, O sleeper, to awake. I didn't create you to be held a prisoner in hell. Rise from the dead, for I am the life of the dead. Rise up, work of my hands, you who were created in my image. Rise up, let us leave this place, for you are in me, and I am in you. 2 centuries later, the Bishop of Alexandria, a man named Cyril, he penned one of the most moving reflections, at least for me, on Christ's descent. He said this, when he shed his blood for us, Jesus Christ destroyed death and corruptibility. For if he had not died for us, we should not have been saved. And if he had not gotten down among the dead, listen to this, death's cruel empire would never have been shattered. I love that last line. Because Jesus went down among the dead, death's cruel empire has been shattered. Okay, a few more examples. Protestant artwork of the resurrection, they tend to depict only Jesus rising from the dead. So, here's a classic example. Jesus alone floats in the air in his resurrected form. He's suddenly white and sweet. But throughout Eastern Christendom, so if you were to go to Orthodox churches, for example, you'll find murals and mosaics of the resurrection that depict Jesus shattering death's cruel empire. I think the most stunning of these images is the Anastasis. It's painted on the ceiling of a church in Istanbul, and it depicts Jesus clothed in white. It's a little hard to make everything out. Painting's faded a bit, or on a slide here, but he's standing on top of the shattered gates of hell. And though it's hard to see, Satan is bound at his feet. And unlike Protestant artwork of the resurrection, in this painting, Jesus is pulling Adam and Eve out of their graves as together they lead a procession of liberated souls out of hell. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? I think you're probably asking that. What does this have to do with peacemaking? Well, my goal this morning is not to unpack an in-depth theology of Holy Saturday. In fact, given the limited biblical material on the day, I think such a task would probably produce more questions than answers, at least if you tackle it with humility. But what we can glean from the Bible about Holy Saturday, and what I think we can be confident in, is an important peacemaking lesson, and so what I want to leave you all with. When you contend for peace in places where it's painfully absent, most days feel like Holy Saturday. Silent, confusing, hopeless. Peacemaking can be hard, discouraging work. The destructive forces plaguing our communities can seem unstoppable. Most days, when you watch the news, it feels as if hate has won and the world has gone mad. Am I the only one that feels that way? You know, it can seem just ludicrous to follow the way of the Lamb in a world that's embraced the way of the hammer. Yet even on days when all hope feels lost, Saturday reminds us that Jesus is at work, somehow and in some way, robbing the grave and plundering even the darkest of hell. This lesson, it doesn't mean deny the reality of death and suffering around us. Rather, Holy Saturday gives us the courage to remain immersed in such realities. In other words, on days when God appears absent and it feels as if the principalities and powers of this world have won, Holy Saturday reminds us to press on. And that's a word of hope we desperately need to hear. Press on, my friends, for Jesus is at work beneath the surface, defeating death and dismantling despair. Press on, Willow Creek Friends Church, for the days when Jesus seems most lifeless may actually be the days when he's most actively contending for our peace. And above all, my fellow peacemakers, press on. For although you may not be able to see it, Sunday is coming. Press on. Don't give up. Press on. Let's pray. You descended the Mount of Olives, started the week, Jesus. The crowd shouted tears, but you shed tears. And you cried out for all to hear, only you knew the things that make for peace. Only you knew. Thanks to having studied your actions in some of the days before you, we've grown in our knowledge now of the things that make for peace. And the question that remains is just, what will you do with this knowledge? pray that you would bless Willow to lean more fully into their peacemaking vocation as they seek to cultivate the shalom and the welcome of others into their communities so that they too might experience a transforming, healing, restorative life. Give them the courage to follow the way of the Lamb in a world that's obsessed with their and on days that seem dark, and like all is lost. It's Saturday, we pray all this in your name, Jesus. Prince of Peace. Amen. So, pretty deep stuff. What is Saturday? Kind of a dark and very interesting day that we often forget. But he's with us in the spirit. So let us enjoy the rest of the afternoon or morning. Dinner is at noon, is that right? Lunch. So lunch, whatever. I'm from the country. It's always dinner on Sunday. Clean up your cabins a little and pray homesick. Thank you all. Go in peace.
Oh, yeah? Is it IBEX? That's a good. Want to get in for our house.